Welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Giulia Torino, who's a good friend of CLAS, collaborated with us over the years in many different capacities, and is now at King's College London in the Department of Geography. So won't go into any long introduction. I'll let Giulia take the stage and talk us through today's.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Pedro and Paula and all of CLAS for this invitation. It has been almost 2 years since I was last year, so it's really nice to be back. It's always great to see some familiar faces and meet new people as well. So just to give you a bit of a background for this talk and an overview of what it draws on, it mainly stems from my doctoral research, which was admittedly a few years ago. I finished in 2021, but for various reasons, the two main articles stemming from this project recently came out a few months ago. So the presentation tries to draw on these two articles and on two concepts the articles present. One article is about Mestizo urbanism and the other on relational urban territories. I realized that covering both of them might have been really ambitious of me for a half an hour, 40 minutes talk, so we might focus on the former more than the latter, but we'll see how it goes. Just for a bit of a background, as I was saying, this research stems from my doctoral studies. I did an ethnographic research, an urban ethnography in Bogotá between 2017 and 2019. And this focused on questions of race, displacement, and city making across three main areas of the city, but also looking at the city as a whole in a way, at the connections within it. And it was based on, of course, a lot of observational data, over 80 in-depth interviews between 1 and 4 hours each, and collaborations as well with Afro-Colombian organizations in the city, including Cimarrons and Afrodes, for those of you who might be familiar with them, but also grassroots collectives and social leaders across two main areas of the city in Western Suba, and we will see a map of Bogotá shortly to locate it, and Altos de Casuca in the southwest of the city, for those of you who are familiar with it. So I'd like to start with this question for the presentation, which is, why is it important to engage race and racism in Latin American city making? And the reason I thought about starting with this is that by now we have many important sociological and anthropological contributions to the understanding of race making and racism across Latin America. But comparably, we have very few that engage the urban space, both from a top-down perspective of urban governance and urban policy, but also from a bottom-up perspective of everyday forms of city making, including informal city making. And so I'd like to start approaching this question from three main theses. The first one is that race is a technology of differentiation and exclusion, as we know, but is also a very geographical one. And I'm saying this because I've been looking in my research at race as a spatial construct, in the way in which racial categories emerge from historical and spatial processes. But also looking at movements of resistance against forms of racialization in the city, which are also spatial in nature. And we will see what I mean by these later in the second part of the talk in particular, and how in particular they suggest alternative geographical imaginations of collective life in the city. The second thesis is that mestizaje was, and arguably still is, a spatial matter. And this is evident, or has been evident to me in two main ways. On the one hand, in the fact that the idea of the raceless city in Latin America, which is still persistent, as we will see in a lot of debates, especially by urban experts and government officers, but also urban residents, is rooted in the ideology of mestizaje. And the other side of this is that urban planning and urban governance consequently reinforce racial hierarchies while at the same time disguising racialism as classism, regionalism, ethnic self-segregation, and virtually anything but race. And finally, the third thesis is that multicultural cosmopolitanism won't solve by itself or in the way it is currently conceived racial inequality and injustice in cities. And this is because on the one hand, while a lot of Latin American cities, especially metropolises, including Bogotá, in recent years have been claiming racial inclusivity through multicultural urban agendas, at the same time their urban structures and policies continue to be systematically organized to disadvantage Afro-descendant and indigenous populations. And as a consequence of these, racial difference in cities continue to shape access of residents to space, to resources, and opportunities, even and especially sometimes in multicultural cities. So to start unpacking how race is geographical in Colombia and consequently, as we will see in Bogotá as well, one really only needs looking at the map of residential concentration of Afro-Colombians in the country. And as you can see, the Pacific coast, the western coast of Colombia, has a predominant population of Afro-descendant of Afro-Colombians, whereas other parts of the country, this concentration is considerably lower. But very important is also a study that was conducted in 2013 by the Observatorio de Discriminación Racial in Bogotá, which concluded that Colombia is a racially and socioeconomically segregated country at the macro-regional scale. Specifically, the distribution of Afro-Colombians in the country is concentrated in the two coasts, the Pacific especially, where the distribution of the Afro-Colombian population corresponds to a lower quality of life since colonial times. So in other words, this map is telling us that the concentration of black citizens in Colombia and in specific areas of the country has been inversely connected to the concentration of economic means. Now this map draws on relatively, well not so relatively actually, old data from the census of 2005. But it's still, that census for many reasons still represents a more accurate representations of things. But the most recent census is the one from 2018, which offers as only slightly different overview of Afro-Colombian concentrations, but especially in Bogotá, if you see compared to the previous maps, where Bogotá would be this part here, where according to the census of 2005, allegedly there was a very, very low concentration of Afro-Colombians. In the 2018 census, Bogotá appears as one of the hotspots of internal Afro-Colombian migration. And of course, as we know, this was largely due, or to some extent due to the internal conflict in Colombia, which has disproportionately affected indigenous and Afro-Colombian populations. Now, dating a few years before the last census in 2016 is what is still to date the most reliable study conducted on ethnic residential concentrations in Bogotá, which was a study conducted by Cali-based sociologists and economists Fernando Urrea and Carlos Biafara. And despite this study was also based on the 2005 census, so most likely it represents a severe underestimation of the real numbers of Afro-Colombians living in Bogotá today, it showed for the first time with this level of precision, so at the level of the borough, the distribution of Afro-Colombian residents, counting an overall 9.5% in the capital population. And those marks with the red crosses were the three main areas in which I focus my research. So the west, the northwest of the city, in Suba, the southwest, on the border between Altos de Casuca and Ciudad Bolívar, and in the city center, the historical center of the city. So to start understanding the economical and the political structure of the urban space in Bogotá today, we must examine the history of racialization as a spatialized social difference in Latin American city making. And this, of course, began in the colonial period, and in different forms, often disguised, as we will see, continues today. And I usually start with the overview by drawing on Uruguayan scholar Ángel Rama, and then moving on to Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano to show how the colonization of the spatial imaginary and of social structures was translated into the urban form of cities as kind of crystallization of those social hierarchies. But for sake of time today, I will just skip directly to this very sharp analysis by Claudia Mosquera, who wrote, "I understand the white Mestizo nation as a project of modern society, though of colonial origin, that values cultural and biological mestizaje. Such an ideology insists that the Colombian nation is a harmonious biological and cultural fusion of races and cultures. The existence of the socio-racial hierarchies is rarely questioned, as it is seen as a natural and invisible order. Additionally, the presence of racism or racial discrimination is dismissed or denied." And indeed, if we start looking at these issues from the scale of the city rather than the one of the nation, which has been more often inquiry, Mosquera goes on to say, "The capital city, Bogotá, is seen as a quintessential regional metropolis, presenting itself as progressive and inclusive through public social policies aimed at diversity. In this sense, Black presence becomes an added value for local institutions as it, quote-unquote, adds color to municipal programs focused on ethnic differentiation and, quote-unquote, anti-racist initiatives." Now, the problem in Bogotá, as in other Latin American metropolises, with the shift from mestizaje to multiculturalism at the national scale, and as an official national imaginary and kind of ideology or political basis for national governance, was that the racial ideology underlying mestizaje in the form of a white supremacy never truly disappeared with the rise of multiculturalism. Instead, it retained significance in multicultural nations and cities alike. And an example of this stems, for example, from a series of interviews, but one in particular that I want to mention today that I conducted with the former director of the Directorate of Ethnic Affairs in the Secretaría de Gobierno in Bogotá. So this is the government office in Bogotá which is in charge of quote-unquote multicultural policies for the city. And they emblematically told me that Bogotá needed to be multicultural in order to become progressively cosmopolitan and economically competitive at an international level. So multiculturalism in Bogotá started to emerge not as much as a social agenda, but rather as an economic one. And the first step in this direction was to launch at the municipal level what several city officials described to me as Bogotá's first anti-racist campaign. And this was the so-called #RacisNo. And it is relevant to also highlight that this initiative only emerged after a high-profile racial discrimination case, which happened in Bogotá's elite nightlife district, the Zona Rosa, which gained international media attention. So after that, the municipality had to do something, because Bogotá was being branded internationally as a racist city. And so the campaign was launched in July 2018 with a public concert in the Plaza de Bolívar, which is the central square of the city, and it featured an internationally renowned Afro-Colombian music group, Chokip Town, as the guest of honor. But more than a year after, since this launch, the campaign's impact was still very minimal, to say the least, consisting mainly of some tweeters on the page of the Secretaría de Gobierno, some posters placed across Bogotá's wealthiest and most international visible areas, and not much more. And so in a critical reading of these campaigns, some issues started to emerge. First of all, the lack of presence of this campaign in the neighborhoods with the highest residential concentration of Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples, which is where most cases of racialization actually happen. The fact that there was no municipal interventions at all benefiting racially marginalized urban populations. It was a discursive campaign, if we will. The framing of anti-racism in this campaign was also conceived as something intermittent, symbolic rather than material, and not quite connected to sustained social struggles, especially those of long-standing racial justice movements active in Bogotá. He also did not engage the political economy of race in the city at all, nor the material conditions of racialized urban residents, thus reducing racism to a cultural issue. And so this case reveals the superficiality or the lack of structural change in Bogotá's multicultural view and understanding of what anti-racism from the top down can represent. So going back to our initial question, and especially the three theses that followed from that, I suggested a tentative conceptual framework to start possibly unpacking these three theses. And the framework is what, in one of these two papers that I'm sharing with you today, is I defined as Mestizo urbanism. And I define this as a way, the dominant way, of producing the modern city in Latin America based on a racial ideology, that of mestizaje and its legacy, that has concealed the role of race and racism in shaping spatial inequalities. And in Bogotá, in my own reading of this has been operated mainly through three technologies or devices, if you will, of disguise. On the one hand, and we will look at all of them in detail in a moment, one of them is what I called normative technologies. So I'm referring here to mostly planning practices and policies at the municipal level that have been privileging mestizo and white spaces while hiding racialization behind the veil of socioeconomic inequality. So as we will see, this is often represented by the idea of a homogeneous urban pool in the city. Another one is discursive. So here, instead, we see the framing of racialized spatial injustice as always something else, whether it's classism, regionalism, ethnic self-segregation or alleged self-segregation, and quote-unquote history. And it's in quotes, as we will see in a moment, because it is not really factual history. And finally, operational technologies. And this refers instead to the more everyday, more banal, if you will, spaces of city making from the bottom up, in a way. So these are examples that as we will see, of de facto denials of placemaking and belonging through ordinary urban practices. So starting to go a bit more in detail into the first, the idea of normative technologies to dissimulate race. And perhaps, if I had to choose one sentence that best encapsulated this approach, it would be this, which is a quote that a world-leading urban expert who I met in Bogotá, he's not Colombian, but I met him in Bogotá at the beginning of my PhD, told me. And they said, it is quite racist to focus on the segregation of black people alone in such a multicultural society. It would be much better to explore urban segregation from the socioeconomic perspective of class and class division, estratos, you know. And for those who are not familiar with the notion of estratos or stratification in Colombia, please bear with me because I will introduce it in a moment. And so this quote, this sentence made me think of a publication by Tania Cateri Hernandez, who wrote about the multiracial matrix. And she highlighted in particular 4 precepts of Latin America's race ideology. And I think this approach, which is very common among urban experts and urban planners, not just in Bogotá, but across Latin America, exemplifies at least 2 of these 4 precepts. The first, according to her, is that racial mixture is a solution to racial problems. The second is that fluid racial classifications are indicators of racial progress and colorblindness of racial harmony. The third is that racism is an individual problem, but is not structural. And the fourth is that focusing on race is racist. Of course, Tanya Hernandez was widely critical of all of this, but she identified this presence as leading in this kind of debates that seek to disguise or invisibilize the role of race in shaping Latin American societies in her case, and arguably also urban spaces. And undoubtedly, when we start looking at Bogotá as a case study, but also arguably many other cities across the region, the city continues to be considered by the municipality, by urban experts, as a class-based, shaped by class-based kind of segregation, devoid of any racial inflection. And these are just some of the many publications on urban segregations that have been published in recent years, and all of them insist on the socio-economic element of segregation. However, what is repeatedly missing from this analysis is the racial root of socioeconomic inequality in Latin America. And so perhaps the answer to the question that we saw here, why not to focus on socioeconomic segregation, could be, we could start looking for an answer in earlier research, and especially not so much in urban studies, because there isn't as much, but in social anthropology perhaps, on the interlinking reality of race and class. And here a very foundational quote and work has been the one of Peter Wade, who wrote, "To invert a famous phrase of Stuart Hall's, that race is the modality in which class is lived, one could say that in Latin America, class is the modality in which race is lived." And of course, Wade was looking primarily at the nation state, if not at the region, as a scale of understanding. But even from an urban perspective, not only this stays true, but also we could add to this final part, that class is the modality in which race is lived, we could also add that space is the modality in which the entanglement of class and race is sustained, experienced, and negotiated. Another approach, or an approach that goes hand in hand with this, could be to look at the stratification system of Bogotá, the one that the urban expert we mentioned earlier suggested me to look at. But interestingly, as I looked at it, I came to a very different conclusion to the one they were suggesting. Now, for those unfamiliar with Colombia's socioeconomic stratification system, estratos or estratificación is an official classification of urban areas in all main cities, and it is described as a classification of residential properties that must receive public service, which was originally thought and introduced to alleviate urban poverty by using the higher taxes paid by wealthier households to subsidize infrastructure development in poorer neighborhoods. In practice, however, it has evolved into a socio-spatial system of internal hierarchies in the city, segregation and unequal social relationships, and also stigmatization of many areas. And so, in this context, something that surprised me early on in the research was that these two maps were never juxtaposed. And the one on the left is a map of the stratification, so the socioeconomic divisions in the city from the lowest one to the wealthiest, the sixth, with the map to the right, which is a map based not on the census of 2005, but on a more recent encuesta multipropósito that was developed specifically on Bogotá, and it was the first one that showed Afro-Colombian residential concentrations per neighborhood, or per borough, or rather, per barrio. So with each of these are barrios instead of the previous one that I showed you, which was just the broader scale of the borough. So it's a much more precise understanding of concentrations. And when we start looking at this, we can see how highest concentrations are often focused, if not always focused, in in the barrios with the lowest strata, so 1 and 2. And so from this point of view, it is perfectly in line not only with what Wade was arguing in 2006, as we saw in the previous slide, but also with what we saw in the map of Colombia as a whole. So in many ways, the capital city here can be conceived as a sort of micro-word that presents that broader dynamics happening at the national scale, but within the urban scale. But this situation is not unique or peculiar of Bogotá either. A similar pattern is to be found in Cali, Colombia's third biggest city, where the social-spatial pattern of inequality is actually much harsher and indicates that 3/4 of Afro-Colombians live in the city's popular settlements. But also in Brazil, there have been research on this, for example, on Salvador, in Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, where researchers have noticed that even after the abolition of slavery, the black population continued to cover the same urban areas, the same positions, the same functions, and that cities are marked by a sharp spatial differentiation along class and racial lines intersecting. And yet, especially since the multicultural turn in Bogotá, the concealment of racism in the space of the city has been operated also in more subtle and yet more complex ways than before. And this leads us to the second form of concealment, the one of discursive technologies. And I won't have the time, of course, to go too much in detail into that, but I just wanted to highlight 5 main types, if you will, or 5 main ways in which these discursive technologies have been working in Bogotá. The first is what I try to define as historical erasure. And this typically denies the historical presence of Afro-Colombians in Bogotá, a city that has been often referred to as the Athens of South America, so a narrative rooted in Eurocentrism and whiteness, where Afro-Colombian presence has been denied both in historical terms and in the present. The second is spatial erasure, or narratives about the placelessness of Afro-Colombians. And this fundamentally essentializes the link between displacement and blackness in Colombia and in Bogotá as well, reinforcing the idea that Afro-Colombians are in Bogotá only due to the country's internal forced displacement, and that they do not originally belong to Bogotá, as if white populations did. The third is the paradigm of regional determinism. And here, this is based instead on the denial of racialized discrimination through regionalism. So basically dismissing racism by attributing Afro-Colombians' marginalization and discrimination against them to regional origins rather than racial identities or racialized social structures, rather. Denying what in fact is a deeply racialized system of regionalism in Colombia, which is exemplified by sentences like "nobody wants to live near Costeño." And these are all quotes from interviews, and many of these quotes have been recurring across dozens and dozens of interviews. So that's why I thought they would have been illustrative to put on the slide. The fourth one is the one of class determinism, and this one is possibly the most common that I've encountered in narratives and interviews. And this fundamentally erases race and racism in discussions about urban inequality and urban justice, ignoring what we already saw in the previous slides, that is the inseparable connection between race and class in the make of Bogotá's urban space. And finally, cultural determinism, which here indicates the depoliticization of culture, which allegedly should explain racial segregation as a form of cultural preference, that is, Afro-Colombians wanting to be segregated rather than a system of systemic discrimination, as of course is. So just a few considerations on this and what, in my view, this apparatus is pointing at. On the one hand, I've noticed a considerable lack of racial awareness among urban planners. And planners, municipal officials, architects, and other quote-unquote urban experts in the city, that often leads to racialized prejudice against black but also indigenous populations in urban development policies and strategies. The second point is that there is still a scarcity of quantitative studies, and this leads, as many Afro-Colombian organizations and activists have denounced, this leads to statistical invisibility of black and indigenous populations. Not just in terms of demographic concentrations across the city, but also an understanding of spatial mobility due to so-called double displacement, so within different parts of the city. And also a lack of understanding oftentimes on the part of the municipality of overall patterns and spatial praxis of urban life. How do different groups come to create the city and produce and reproduce the city? And finally, and this is perhaps a bit more of an issue of academic debates rather than something from the part of the municipality, a lack of interdisciplinary dialogues between the social sciences on the one hand, so a lot of research that has been done on these issues in social anthropology, sociology, economics, and urban studies on the other hand. Now the final element is what I call the operational one. And this is about ordinary practices of dissimulation. And this is meaningfully emblematized, for instance, in Bogotá by cultural approaches to property. So in Colombia, as elsewhere, scarce access to housing, of course, has been a critical political issue for many years. But the housing market is particularly inaccessible in cities like Bogotá for Afro-Colombian residents. And this is due not only to their disproportionate presence in the lowest economic strata, as we saw, but also to white Mestizo residents' common practice of avoiding black presence in quote-unquote their neighborhoods. Now, of course, differently from cities in the US, for instance, in Colombian cities there has been a lack of a legal system for racialized segregation, and this has induced many commentators, from public officers to urban academics, to deny the existence of discriminatory housing practices in Latin American cities. But while housing discrimination operated by falsely denying that a rental unit is available only because it is an Afro-Colombian resident trying to rent it, even though these kind of practices are common in other parts of the world and indeed outside of Latin America, what is specific, I think, about the Latin American case is a common attitude of denial or disguise of these kind of things, so rather than a more open societal denunciation. And some of Afro-Colombian residents during my research have reported racist rental practices of exclusion towards them, especially in working class districts of Bogotá, but also, as we will see in a moment, in some wealthy areas. And some signs like this, reading no rentals for black people or renting available but not for black people, were seen by some of my interviewees outside rented properties, particularly as I was saying, in working class neighborhoods. But housing discrimination is not absent outside of these neighborhoods too. And I will just try to illustrate this through two very brief vignettes. The first one comes from a conversation a few years ago, an interview with an Afro-Colombian woman in her 50s that we will call Betty, using a pseudonym. And Betty used to live in central Bogotá. And in the early 2000s, she was asked to help a Brazilian colleague who was coming to Bogotá for a few months to find a rental apartment in the city. And so she goes off to find a suitable apartment for her colleague, and she schedules a visit. And after arriving at this visit, the landlord, immediately seeing her, tells her that the apartment was no longer available, even though the sign for rent was still very visibly on the flat, on the door. So Betty goes home, but is quite suspicious, and so she decides to call a friend of hers, a white Mestizo friend of her, and she asks her to book another visit. And so her friends go to attend this other visit, and the landlord indeed not only agrees on the visit, but also agrees on renting the house to Betty's friends. Now, of course, this is only an anecdote, but this kind of racialized rental exclusion practices have echoed in dozens similar accounts with other interviewees across my fieldwork. And they illustrate a series of dynamics. On the one hand, the absence of Afro-Colombians in certain areas of Bogotá and their concentrations in others, the non-explicit but nonetheless systemic racial barriers that shape access to housing, especially rental in Bogotá, and how these informal kind of prohibitions, and I say informal because there isn't a legal system that prescribes there, that is operated therefore not by the government but by individual choices or cultural choices, if you will, contributes to the racialization of the urban space. The second vignette is from a much wealthier area of Bogotá, but is not too dissimilar from the former. And even though only about 3% of Bogotá's Afro-Colombian population live in upper socioeconomic estratos, wealthy Afro-Colombians also experience racial discrimination, though this often happens in more subtle ways than the explicit racism that we saw with the rental, the sign, for example. One anecdote here came from Claudia, another pseudonym, who is an Afro-Colombian professional living near Rosales, which is, for those who don't know, Bogotá is one of the most exclusive residential neighborhoods in the city. And she told me how she struggled to find an apartment despite her capacity to pay the very high rents of Rosales due to racial bias against her. And even after she managed to move in, recurrently her white mestizo neighbors mistake her, quote unquote mistake her, for a domestic worker during everyday interactions in the street. And a similar account was made to me by Lucia, another pseudonym, another Afro-Colombian professional who lives in the upscale Parque del Virrey, another very exclusive residential areas of the city. And she was telling me about a courier, actually multiple couriers, who refused to deliver a package to her because only the quote-unquote owner of the house could sign for it. And so the assumption of the delivery person was that the owner of such a wealthy household could not be a black woman like her, and she must have been therefore a domestic worker. So these kind of experiences reveal that similarly to working class neighborhoods, even in wealthy areas, Afro-Colombian residents are often marked as outsiders. And this is particularly visible in historically white mestizo cities like Bogotá. And it is important to notice because it further debunks the classist myth that we talked about before of Afro-Colombians not being discriminated against because of race, but because of class. So, coming to an attempted definition of what these forms of city making could be, I try to define mestizo urbanism as a way of knowing the city, of analyzing, representing, and producing the urban space, and of determining which urban knowledge counts, and therefore which doesn't, that is deeply enmeshed in the racial ideology of mestizaje with its underlying social project of whitening, despite and within the most recent constitutional turn based on multiculturalism. Some of the features of mestizo urbanism are that it flattens different spatial knowledges and experiences through the universalizing syncretism of mestizaje, privileging a spatial episteme that sanctions the city as raceless, allegedly. It also posits non-white mestizo spaces and as known places. And it works as a conditional inclusion and a racialized exclusion from the spaces of the city. And this double and simultaneous inclusion and exclusion, of course, is something that Peter Wade, for example, has talked a lot in the context of the nation state, but that very much works in a spatial form as well, not just socially. And finally, it relies on racial displacements as a form of herbicide. And here in this last point, maybe I need to clarify a bit more that while racial displacements, of course, can take many forms across Latin America, in the case of Colombian cities, often they entail both a form of internal displacement within the country, often from the countryside or smaller towns to bigger cities like Bogotá, Cali, and Medellin. But also it often includes, as it is the case in Bogotá, a form of double displacement, and often multiple double displacement between the city's margins. And this is something that I've noticed consistently in Bogotá, Afro-Colombian families being constantly displaced, for example, between Soacha and Usme and Suba, and so on. So usually among working class neighborhoods. And consequently here, I'm conceiving of urbicide as the killing of a sense of community that goes hand in hand with Afro-Colombian ethnocide, which is something, of course, various social anthropologists have been talked about, from the region to the urban scale. And so finally, we can say that Mestizo urbanism is a product of a few different, simultaneously, a few different dynamics. On the one hand, a product of historical and structural processes of racial colonial marginalization in the afterlife of slavery, but also a product of contemporary forms of discrimination, for example, the one in the housing market, which we just saw, and necropolitics, drawing on Fanon and Mendes' notion of necropolitics. And this, for example, is very visible in racialized forms of double displacement within the city. And third, as a product of racially unequal access to the city under a current neoliberal form of urbanism, which of course neoliberal urbanization is definitely not something unique to Bogotá, but that in this particular context has the effect of economically capture quote-unquote ethnic cultures to extract value from Black and indigenous urban presence. While at the same time, as we saw, while extracting value on the one hand, they're impeding their full access to the city. So, keeping an eye on the time, I will wrap up soon. So I will go over the next few slides really, really quickly. But the idea was to also briefly mention the other side of the coin to some extent. And talking about how Afro-Colombian communities in Bogotá have created, despite, but also as a response to this dominant mode of city making, spaces of life through various practices of placemaking and space making across the whole city, but especially in working class neighborhoods. And while the historical and contemporary agency of Afro-descendants and Black racial politics in Colombia has largely been studied in the context, especially of rural communities and especially in the Pacific coast, it is also important to consider how cities can be and are indeed scenarios of struggle and alternative geographical propositions. And I say geographical because they're not just social propositions, but very much spatial propositions as well. And not just in historically Black cities like Buenaventura or Cali, but also in cities like Bogotá, where, as we saw, Afro-Colombians often encounter the harshest experiences of racialization due to the particular racial colonial history of the capital city. And so in this sense, I was inspired by Rafael Gutierrez's idea of a dissident common sense as a form of quiet marunach. Also related to what Betty Ruth Lozano calls epistemic insurgency, referring to acts of resistance that are much more ordinary and banal, if you will, of the politics of social movements, but not less revolutionary. And it is primarily this kind of quiet politics, or as anthropologist Jaime Alves calls them, spatial praxis, that make cities like Bogotá habitable, despite having been designed to be inhabitable or uninhabitable for Black residents. And so this idea of relational urban territory stemmed from an urban ethnography, which is very much what the second article I wanted to briefly mention today is an urban ethnography of these spaces, of their politics, not just in the sense of the physical spaces, the built environment, which of course is really important, but also in the more broader sense of spatial networks that they create. For example, weaving the whole city of Bogotá together despite its intrinsic segregation through relational networks, but also translocal forms of solidarities, not just within the city, but connecting at all times Bogotá with the Pacific coast, for instance. And also, interestingly, as we will see in the last slide, with connecting Bogotá with other Brazilian cities through black activism. And of course, also as spaces for the preservation of territorial knowledge and culture, which is a role particularly taken up by women, and by women who were themselves migrant to Bogotá rather than city-born. And just scrolling through some examples very quickly for sake of time, but some of these instances which I analyze in much more detail, of course, in the article include huertas urbanas, growing plants originally from the Pacific, the Colombian Pacific, that are then used to make traditional health remedies, to other ancestral forms of health, for example, midwifery, that were erased in the process of territorial whitening operated by modern city making. Of course, barbershops and hair salons, which are not only places for beauty, but also for weaving important informational networks across the whole city, and even with residents of smaller towns nearby, while keeping connections with realities in the places of origin, in the case of migrant communities. Or youth movements and recreational spaces in often informal settlements. This one is from a youth space in Altos de Casuca, one of the two main areas I've worked with, to reappropriate black Colombian music in the white Mestizo capital city, while as activists kept repeating to me, while keeping the youth quote unquote off the streets of drug trafficking and gang violence. But also grassroots collectives made of and run by Afro-Colombian women, especially in this case displaced women, who through socially engaged form of art retell an alternative history of the armed conflict and the displacements stemming from it, which, as you may know, have disproportionately affected black and indigenous communities. And so the work that this collective, for instance, has been doing is not only a rewriting of history through their own embodied life stories embroidered on the telas that you see here, but also a spatial rewriting, insofar as these telas have been used to cover key buildings across the capital city, with the scope of outreach and informing Bogotá's residents of the true unfolding histories of conflict, which are too often found remote from the capital city and its mainstream narratives. And of course also as forms of political denunciations. And so I refer to all these different forms of space and placemaking that are in opposition to, and also forms of dealing from, the violences of Mestizo urbanism as relational territories. And this is perhaps best exemplified by the words of an activist from this particular collective, who is also one of the most inspiring people I've met over the years in Colombia. And she said, this collective is una expansión del territorio, an extension of Afro-Colombian territories. Because todo es territorio, territory is anywhere someone arrives, as displaced, as in her case, but also anywhere someone is. So it's, in her words, is an ontological condition, but also one that is intrinsically geographical, because it needs to be spatialized and collectively spatialized through acts of doing, of caring, of being together, like this. And so in this sense, territory is not merely a prerogative of the rural milieu, as often we find suggested in the scholarship, but also, as we can see here, very much urban territories too. And it is also really not about ethnic fixities, as this collective makes very clear, but is a dynamic enterprise. So it's not bounded to one specific locale, but it's translocal. This collective has branches, if you will, or has networked out across virtually every region of Latin America, as well as abroad to Canada, France, here in the UK, in London as well. and it's a way of recreating continuous connections, not just globally, but also with the towns and regions of origin for a displaced population, even after displacement. So I'll just conclude with this slide, suggesting how these urban territories, relational urban territories in Bogotá, are also a form of destabilizing the typical modes of encountering displacement, and especially displacement essentialized in connection with blackness in the capital city of Bogotá. Whereas these movements mobilize blackness as a system of knowledge, of political denunciation, of social reproduction, rather than only as a system of exclusion, incarceration, or fixed ethnic identities. And so in a way, we can think of it through what Harney and Morton call a fugitive system. And a final example of this, and actually using the word fugitive too, stems from this community space, another of many grassroots initiatives in the south of Bogotá, where a family kitchen was improvised once a week as a community space. And on the whiteboard, I don't know if you can see the words, but there are words like black, fugitive rights, books non-existing, and we have the right to be happy, translated into Portuguese, because they came from this online workshop between these Afro-Colombian women activists in the south of Bogotá and a group of women activists, Afro-Brazilian women activists. So I think I'll just conclude here. I'll just leave some conclusions, which are just summaries, really, of what we said so far, and perhaps one opening rather than a conclusion at the end, which is, what would Bogotá look like if city making was rethought from a relational, decolonial, although I try not to use this term for the mainstream way in which it has been used in recent years, and racial justice point of view. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Julia. Thanks very much indeed for that talk.